Alright guys, so we have just a couple of topics to finish up, to wrap up talking about your immune system. And one of them just is the idea that there's evolutionary adaptations for your pathogens. So when we look at the evolution of pathogen versus the evolution of the immune system, we're talking about coevolution here. So as our immune system evolves to continue to get better to fight those pathogens also then have to evolve mechanisms to get around that immune response. Otherwise, they're ultimately going to get wiped out. So one of the ways in which those pathogens end up evolving is to have antigenic variation. So remember when we looked at those antigens, you've got sort of this base that fits in or connects to the cell membrane or the viral envelope. But then the epitope, the end of that antigen, is what is ultimately being connected to an antibody. So that's where the connection comes from. So if we can end up evolving changes, or most of the time it's because of mutation, to that epitope, then that pathogen all of a sudden can't get recognized by the immune system, by the antibody, and so it continues to infect. So that's all this graph is happening to look at, is that every time a variant comes across, or we talk about them as different strains of the same flu, for example, it's because those epitopes, those ends of those antigens, are differently shaped enough that the antibody doesn't recognize it. So that's going to allow the continuation of that pathogen to infect, and that's useful to them as an evolutionary pathway so that they're getting around our immune system. There's also the ability for that virus to remain dormant or latent. Herpes, for example, right? Cold sores. They're present in our host cells, sometimes even getting passed on without severe symptoms. And so they're getting around our immune system. They're able to reproduce at least at low enough levels to keep their population moving forward, but they're not actually destroying their host. So one of the things we talked about way at the beginning of this section was the idea of how virulent is the pathogen as opposed to what that ends up doing then to their host. So a more virulent species is going to cause their host to be completely laid out, if not killing them entirely. And that in and of itself can potentially be problematic because it's going to cause them to burn out. They're not going to be able to get to their next host as easily. Where if they sort of evolve down a less virulent pathway, they may not make as much of themselves in a short period of time, but they're not causing their host to be laid up in bed or dead. And so they're able to get passed on as a result of that. So there's definitely evolutionary trade-offs to the way that these viruses, these pathogens infect, and then also the way that our immune system ends up coping with that. Last point I wanted to make is just this interesting connection that we're finding actually more and more, that certain cancers are actually increasing when that adaptive immunity gets impaired. So we get the virus, we get infected, and we are finding that at least about 20% of all human cancers involved some sort of viral infection that we had in the past. So that's problematic. Your immune system also can then act to defend that virus that ends up causing the cancer. Cancer cells harvest the viruses, so there's all sorts of interactions that are going on, and we're finding more and more connections to your immune system, to infection from viruses that are being connected to cancer. One example, all right, if you've had the Gardasil vaccine, why are we giving that vaccine? Well, it's a vaccine against cervical cancer. Specifically, not the cancer, but the HPV vaccine, the HPV virus, I should say, having that viral infection ends up causing cervical cancer. And we're actually now also making connections to it to prostate cancer. So originally when this vaccine came out, it was really targeted to young women, and now we're finding, well, it's also helping out young men as well. So can we potentially eradicate things like prostate and cervical cancer, at least the ones that are connected to the HPV infection, maybe. And most people don't even know they have the HPV infection because the virus itself doesn't actually cause any major symptoms. So it's easily passed, doesn't really cause symptoms that the host is even aware of or even aware of. but we're associating it now with cervical cancer down the road.